origin of the first settlements. In a remote corner of the past, when the world still knew nothing of cities or kings, when the sky was simply the immense roof of a land yet to be discovered, human beings began to make a decision that would change them forever. It was a quiet choice, perhaps imperceptible at the time, but with deep consequences. There, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, something was born that had never existed before. The will to stay, to stop, to build a life where before there had only been wandering. In that fertile land that would later be known as Mesopotamia, among vast plains, mighty rivers, and seasons marked by sudden rains and scorching summers, ancient hunter-gatherers began to leave behind deeper traces than those of their leather sandals in the mud. They discovered that some plants, if sown in the moist soil after the floods, would grow again year after year, and that if cared for, they provided more food than one could find by roaming the forests or chasing prey for days. It was not a fast transition. There was no exact day when people switched from hunting to agriculture, nor a single night when a group suddenly decided to become sedentary. It was a transformation that stretched across generations, almost imperceptible to those who lived it, but monumental from the distance of centuries. Small human groups began building huts of mud and branches, very close to the rivers. There they stayed for longer seasons, tended their crops, stored food, and slowly began to weave what we now understand as society. In places like Jericho, in the Levant, or Çatalhöyük, in Anatolia, and later in Jarmo, east of the Tigris, appeared the first signs of something entirely new: permanence. Clustered houses, refined tools, stone walls, and communal ovens. There, people did not just eat, sleep, or cook. They were born there. They died there. They buried their ancestors beneath the floors of their homes. These communities were not simply shelters from the weather. They were a declaration that human beings had finally chosen a place in the world. The region where Mesopotamia flourished offered a unique setting. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, with their unpredictable floods, gave life and, at the same time, imposed their own rules. They were sources of fertility, but also of destruction. The settlers learned not only to sow, but to control the water, to build canals, dikes, drainage ditches. This knowledge, passed down from generation to generation, gave rise to the first forms of complex social organization. Agriculture required cooperation. A lone hunter or a small group of relatives was no longer enough. Planning was needed. Tasks had to be distributed. Irrigation schedules had to be set. Disputes resolved. The seed of social order was planted alongside the barley. Over time, these first settlements began to exchange products with one another. Some had access to stone for tools, others to wood, salt, or metals. Barter was not only an economic act, but also a means of cultural contact. Techniques, myths, songs, even religious customs began to travel along the primitive routes that connected the villages. Without writing a single word yet, people shared knowledge that allowed them to grow, adapt, and thrive. Clay was the great ally of this early world. With it, not only dwellings were shaped, but also figurines, vessels, and, in time, the first sun-dried bricks. This humble material, as abundant as it was malleable, allowed constructions to become more durable, larger, more complex. Villages expanded. Common spaces emerged, ritual areas, small storerooms where surplus crops were kept. For the first time, there was more food than needed to survive, and with that came the possibility for some to dedicate themselves to different tasks, to priesthood, to pottery, to observing the skies. And in the midst of this new life, anchored to the land, the notion of belonging also emerged. A place was no longer just a point on the map. It was a home, a site to which blessings were asked, protection, rain. The first religious symbols appeared, the first deities associated with the earth, with water, with fertility. Small female figurines with exaggerated features were buried beneath the houses or placed on makeshift altars. Human beings were beginning to understand that their fate depended on forces they could not control, but which they could invoke, worship, or appease. The most profound change, however, was internal. From an existence marked by constant movement, by the urgency of the present, people transitioned to a life that required planning, memory, and hope for the future. The agricultural cycle forced them to think about tomorrow, to save part of the harvest, to anticipate catastrophes. A different relationship with time was born. The calendar was not yet written, but it was already felt in the bones of those who sowed in spring and harvested in autumn. In this setting, the first awareness of history began to take shape. Communities began to remember, to tell stories about how they arrived there, about what their ancestors had taught them, about how the canal was built that saved the village during the last drought. These oral accounts would be the basis, centuries later, of the great Mesopotamian myths. The word had not yet been inscribed in clay, but it already echoed around the nightly campfires. Thus, in the warm darkness of a mud hut, surrounded by green fields and brown water, beneath a vast and indifferent sky, the first sedentary humans began to write, without ink or letters, the first chapter of our civilization. And they did so with humble tools, a hoe, a vessel, a wall of adobe. But the most important thing was the decision they made to stay, because with that simple act, they founded the idea of home, of city, of history. What would come next? Writing, law, temples, empires, would be a direct consequence of that first step. Mesopotamia did not begin with kings or battles. It began with the silence of freshly plowed earth, with the murmur of water between the canals, with the soft voices that told how once someone decided to plant a seed and wait. And it is from that seed, invisible but powerful, that we will begin to explore the rest of this millenary story. Now that the land has been sown, we will move forward to the emergence of the first cities, where clay is transformed into brick and fields into centers of power and spirituality. The first cities of the world await us. Babylonian religion, and the creation myth. Amid the sun-baked bricks, the walls of temples raised with devotion, and the chants echoing through sacred courtyards, Babylonian religion was not a marginal practice, nor a ceremonial ornament. It was the backbone that articulated the entirety of the world. For the Babylonians, everything, from the fate of kings to the murmuring of rivers, responded to a divinely orchestrated order, a delicate balance that could not be broken without unleashing primordial chaos. To understand their worldview is not merely an archaeological task, but rather an immersion into a universe conceived as alive, sacred, and deeply symbolic. At the heart of this vision stood the Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian creation epic. This text, ritually recited during the New Year festivities, was not simply a fantastic tale. It was a theological revelation, a political legitimization, and a tool for social cohesion. Its verses did not merely recount the birth of the world. They explained why Babylon was the center of the universe, why Marduk was the rightful king of the gods, and why human beings had been created to serve them. The narrative begins before firm land existed, when all was a tangled sea, a confused mass of waters without shape or direction. From that primeval fusion emerged two figures: Apsu, the fresh water, symbol of ancestral order, and Tiamat, the salt water, mother of all gods, but also the embodiment of chaos. Together they gave birth to the first divine generations, young, noisy, active deities who soon began to disturb Apsu's tranquility. Enraged, Apsu resolved to destroy them, but his plan was thwarted when Ea, the god of wisdom, overcame him through cunning, put him to sleep, and killed him. Furious over the death of her consort, Tiamat transformed. She became terrifying, monstrous, and summoned an army of demons and dragons. She appointed Kingu as their commander, giving him the tablets of destiny, sacred objects that conferred absolute authority over the cosmos. It was the beginning of a divine war, the mother of chaos against her own children. And in this turbulent scenario, Marduk emerges. Marduk, until then a minor deity, offered his help to the divine assembly on one condition: that if he defeated Tiamat, he would be proclaimed sovereign of all gods. The others agreed. Thus, armed with magical nets, hurricane winds, and a massive mace, Marduk faced the great cosmic serpent. The battle was titanic. With a roar that split the skies, Marduk ensnared Tiamat in his net, pierced her with a spear, and split her in two. With one half he fashioned the sky, with the other, the earth. He established the seasons, set the courses of rivers, fixed the celestial bodies in their orbits, and restored order to the universe. But something was still missing. From the blood of Kingu, Tiamat's fallen lieutenant, Marduk shaped human beings. Not as free creatures, but as servants of the gods, tasked with maintaining their temples, feeding their cults, and repeating their hymns. In the Babylonian worldview, humanity was not the center of creation, but its instrument, a necessary yet secondary being. Born from defeated chaos, its role was to ensure that chaos never returned. This myth, brutal as it may seem, served a complex purpose. It explained the order of the world, justified Babylon's authority, and gave meaning to the social structure. Marduk was not just a powerful god. He was the architect of the universe, and his triumph legitimized the supremacy of his city. If Babylon reflected the divine victory on earth, then its hegemony was not a political conquest, but a cosmic necessity. Each year, during Akitu, the New Year festival, this story was dramatized and recited in ceremonies that included processions, purification rituals, and symbolic enactments. The Babylonian king himself participated. He was required to remove his regalia, confess his shortcomings before the high priest, and accept that his authority depended solely on Marduk's will. After this ritual act of humility, the king was reinvested with his royal insignia, and the covenant between the city, its ruler, and the gods was renewed. Politics and religion merged in a single theatrical act that reminded everyone of their place within the great machinery of the cosmos. Babylonian religion did not promise personal salvation or a paradise after death. The post-mortem fate was bleak and undifferentiated, a dusty underworld where shadows wandered without distinction, far from life's pleasures. But what mattered was not the promise of another world, but the preservation of this one in balance. That is why rituals were so important, and temples so monumental. They were the nerve centers of civilization, points of contact between the human and the divine, and also administrative, economic, and political institutions. There, tributes were stored, contracts signed, and verdicts issued. The temple was not just the house of the god, it was the heart of the city. Lesser deities, Ishtar, Shamash, Nergal, Ninurta, played specific roles in this cosmology. They oversaw war, justice, death, or fertility. Their personalities were rich, mutable, often contradictory. Some were protective and vengeful at once. There was no clear divide between good and evil. The world was a place of nuance, and the gods, like humans, had passions, tempers, and whims. This view reinforced the idea that proper behavior was not optional. It was necessary to retain divine favor. A botched ritual, a poorly made offering, a broken vow could unleash plagues, droughts, wars, or floods. In this religious framework, the priest's role was essential. Not merely an intermediary, the priest was an interpreter of the divine language, a guardian of order. He could read omens, interpret dreams, cast spells, and determine which actions were needed to avoid divine punishment. In a world so saturated with symbols, signs were everywhere. In the flight of birds, in the liver of a sacrificed sheep, in the way a vessel shattered. Anything could be a message, anything a warning. Babylon's greatness was upheld as much by its walls as by its mythology. The Enuma Elish was not just a liturgical text. It was a declaration that the world must function as a replica of heaven, and any deviation from that sacred order could drag all back into the original chaos. It was not merely a poem, it was a treatise on responsibility. And so, among glazed brick temples, columns of incense, and clay tablets, Babylonian religion taught that the universe was fragile, that chaos always lurked beneath the surface, and that the only way to keep it at bay was to obey, repeat, and honor. Creation was not a finished act. It was a process to be renewed daily, in every prayer, every sacrifice, every law etched in stone. With this intricate and beautiful structure, Babylon became the city where heaven spoke, mankind obeyed, and the gods watched. But beyond its temples and myths, new winds were beginning to blow from the north. They carried with them a different vision of power, more violent, more vertical, more pragmatic. From the fertile land of the Tigris, another city rose from the shadows and strategy, Ashur, and with it, a new kind of empire. The rise of the Assyrian Empire and its war machine. On the banks of the Tigris River, between fertile plains and sharp mountains, a different kind of power emerged, not one built upon written law or religious poetry, but upon steel and fear. The Assyrian Empire rose as the rawest embodiment of military organization and brutal propaganda. From cities such as Ashur, Kalhu, and Nineveh, the Assyrians invented a model of permanent confrontation, a structure that turned war into art, conquest into ritual, and terror into method. Their rise was not the result of chance, but of a coherent vision of power, where every campaign, every monument, every tactic communicated a single, undeniable message. The Assyrian Empire is inescapable. The turning point came several centuries after the Babylonian collapse. In Ashur, the local temple and administration formed the foundation of a system that understood war as a sacred duty. The king was not merely a military leader, but a commander appointed by the god Ashur. Each conquest was a divine order, each victory a celestial decree. The early kings, such as Tiglath-Pileser I, began expanding the territory. But it was his grandson, Ashurbanipal II, who transformed the empire into an unstoppable machine of aggression and propaganda. Under his rule, the city of Kalhu was rebuilt as a military and administrative capital. There, palaces rose with walls covered in precisely carved reliefs, scenes of lion hunts, bloody sieges, and ritual sacrifices. These images were visual messages. It was not necessary to read the cuneiform texts. The message was in that lion about to be struck down by the king, a clear metaphor for the fate of any people who dared resist. Brutality was staged, proudly displayed to impose order even before the troops arrived. Alongside the brutal image of power was military efficiency. The Assyrians did not invent chariots, composite bows, or bronze weapons, but they perfected their use. Their armies were organized into divisions with professional commanders, standardized equipment, and logistics capable of moving battalions across hundreds of kilometers. They built roads, weapon depots, bridges, and fortifications. They developed advanced strategies for sieges, sabotage of irrigation canals, and the use of siege engines. It was an army that attacked with logic, that knew when to crush morale and when to negotiate surrender. Each captured city became part of an administrative system that imposed tributes, relocated populations, installed Assyrian governors, and restructured local cults to integrate them into the imperial vision. This approach turned the Assyrian Empire into an almost omnipresent organism. The king, from his palace throne, presented himself not as sovereign of a people, but as lord of the entire earth, a Dagon of secular power capable of striking with divine justice. In the reliefs, he was shown decapitating enemy prisoners, but also showing mercy to those who submitted. The message was clear. Capitulation guarantees peace. Resistance brings terror. This logic favored cities that preferred to pay tribute rather than face a wave of destruction. Thus, the empire grew without needing to occupy everything. Military presence became a shadow effective enough to maintain order. Politically, this model also had its ideological counterpart. The Assyrian court promoted the construction of temples to local gods in newly subjugated territories, integrating images of Ashur or Ishtar with native cults. Religion was used as a tool for social control. Every ceremony, every rite, reinforced an imperial narrative. The gods had chosen the Assyrian king to be their instrument, to re-establish the world under his command. And that idea was echoed in every epic tale, in every monumental inscription, in every public prayer. But the true achievement of Assyria lay in its communication system. The commercial route network they had inherited was transformed into an imperial communication system. Messengers could deliver royal orders in a matter of days. News traveled with unprecedented speed, and fear spread just as quickly. Inscriptions were sent to all corners of the empire. The king's decisions were known in remote temples as soon as they were in the palace of Nineveh. This psychological factor proved decisive. The empire existed, but so did its factual, redundant, and over-magnified image. The tremendous weight of terror functioned as a deterrent. The Assyrian chronicles recount barbaric episodes, amputations, mass executions, deportations of entire populations. The destruction of cities that resisted was systematic. But there is also abundant evidence that they administered generously those who accepted their fate. Take care, pay taxes, respect the king, and you will have land, maintenance, and familiar routines. That duality was key to maintaining an incomprehensible level of stability, a balance fueled by constant threat, but sustained by basic incentives for continuity. The result was an empire whose borders were defined more by zones of influence than by geographic lines. Puppet governments, fortified city networks, auxiliary enclosures, mobile garrisons. The Assyrian machine learned to occupy without occupying, to punish without needing to destroy everything, to project power through the logic of terror and ideological projection. That model allowed an unprecedented capacity for control, though it also turned the system into one of constant surveillance, drained by the resources it demanded. A key figure in this evolution was Esarhaddon, who launched complementary campaigns to the east and west. And the most famous of all, Ashurbanipal, the last great warrior king. Under his reign, Assyrian power reached its peak. The palace vaults in Nineveh attested to the wealth, botany, and knowledge of distant cultures. But its walls also displayed military fury, reprisals against defiant peoples, the plundering of hostile temples. It was an ambivalent civilization, capable of beauty and destruction, of instruction and slaughter. The rise of Assyria raised a troubling question for the entire ancient Near East. How does one govern a world that conforms to no limit? Their answer was through perpetual war and the dramatic management of fear. Yet that answer contained its own contradiction. An empire that grows by threatening the very foundation it relies upon: the economy, the population, morale. In the end, it was not a foreign invasion that brought Assyria down, but internal exhaustion, rebellions tied to local classes, regional alliances that found the strength to resist, and the logistical pressure of managing so many territories by force. The fall of Assyria was not the work of a single enemy, but the consequence of its own design. But while it lasted, it was the most powerful empire the world had seen up to that point. Its example influenced the kingdoms that came after: Persia, Babylonia, and later Greece. Because its vision of power as absolute force, projected through organized violence and visual propaganda, left an indelible mark on global politics. And so, after its decline, the ashes of Nineveh gave way to a new, resurgent Babylon, eager to remind the world that another form of power, architectural, poetic, religious, could also be rebuilt among ruins. The city of Nineveh and the library of Ashurbanipal. The height of the Assyrian Empire was not limited to military power or the fearsome reputation of its kings. It also reached an intellectual and cultural dimension without precedent. In Nineveh, the capital established by Ashurbanipal on the banks of the Tigris, a monumental work emerged that astonished even in the midst of the Empire of Terror. A library that, more than an archive, represented the ambition of an empire to preserve and understand the wisdom of all the peoples it ruled. For if Assyrian power had been fierce, it also wished to see itself reflected in the diversity of voices that formed its domain. Upon entering the palace of Nineveh, the visitor was greeted by reliefs that still spoke with the same harshness as those of the palaces of Kalhu: scenes of sieges, royal hunts, gods torn down, and kings in dominant poses. But upon reaching the tablet repositories, a different energy emerged. Ashurbanipal, a cultured man intrigued by scholarship, had ordered the collection of texts that had until then been scattered across temples, cities, and distant archives. Thus, in endless rows of clay shelves were stored hymns, myths, medical treatises, magical texts, dictionaries, and word lists. Each tablet included its origin, its date, its context of use. This library was not a cabinet of curiosities. It was an organized map of knowledge, an intellectual cartography. The compilation was systematic and detailed. Specialized scribes traveled throughout the empire, copying Sumerian works from over a millennium earlier. Astronomical compendiums explaining the movements of Venus or Jupiter, and mathematical texts that demonstrated square roots and complex systems of measurement. There were also collections of commentaries on dreams and weather, spells to cure fevers or to protect against the evil eye. All of this was carefully translated into Akkadian, the administrative language of the empire, and classified according to subject and origin. It was a library designed to endure, with sealed clay boxes and closed shelving to protect its contents from the desert heat. But this archive of wisdom was not the result of purely intellectual interest. It represented a new facet of power, the ability to manage collective memory as a political resource. While the Assyrian army could destroy cities, The library could reconstruct them in imagination. It could absorb traditions, rewriting histories in a language that reaffirmed the empire. The Sumerian works, for example, were not excluded but integrated. In doing so, the empire acknowledged that it had risen upon older foundations and that recognizing this past strengthened its legitimacy. Babylon, Ashur, Uruk, Ur, all these names reappeared in the library, but now under the authority of Nineveh. King Ashurbanipal, behind this initiative, presented himself as a student hungry for knowledge, a cultured aristocrat, a priest of learning. In his official portrait, he is shown reading a tablet while holding a stylus, his gesture suggesting that power not only imposed laws, but also questioned texts, weighed arguments, and acknowledged nuance. That gesture was symbolic. The king could be warrior, priest, or librarian, depending on what was required. His figure helped to associate power with intelligence and foresight. Of course, some tablets also contained propagandistic writings, speeches by the king, accounts of recent victories, lists of destroyed cities. Yet alongside these, one could find ancient works of poetry, hymns to Inanna, stories such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, or Sumerian genealogical lists. That coexistence was evident. The empire defined itself as much by its ability to destroy the previous order as by its skill in preserving it as a universal heritage. In the Library of Nineveh, there was also a deliberate effort towards centralization. Categories were established, reference materials compiled, and glossaries prepared to facilitate translation between languages. The result was impressive. A center of research that functioned as a mediator between cultures, between past and future, between the divine and the king. For centuries, that structure of knowledge would nourish other empires, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, that inherited its texts and its polycentric vision of the ancient world. But not everything was driven by confidence. There was, within that effort, a defensive logic, to preserve, so that the enemy could not destroy everything. Each tablet protected a fragment of identity in the face of imperial violence. The library also served as a den of the past, a refuge where the accumulation of knowledge became a form of mourning for fallen empires and lost peoples. And while Nineveh enjoyed its moment of splendor under the rule of Ashurbanipal, shadows also grew. Internal tensions, local rebellions, and resistance from conquered peoples began to flare in distant provinces. In the temples, prayers became increasingly common, not so much asking for prosperity as begging for the end of the Assyrian era. For maintaining an empire based on war and terror was costly, exhausting, and unstable. At the top of the Library of Nineveh, among tablets that spoke of skies, gods, and architecture, the echoes of daily war also weighed heavily. Walls that had to be reinforced, campaigns that had to be launched against the east or the west. Scribes recorded specific reports, new tribute lists, but they also documented complaints about poor harvests, anxieties about earthquakes, omens that signaled unrest. The machinery of knowledge functioned efficiently, but also with the certainty that intelligence could not completely replace fear. And there, among those shelves, a contradictory story was being written, one that revealed the human dimension of the most ruthless empire, and at the same time foretold the possibility, or the danger, of a new type of authority, one based on the word and not only on the sword. A king who reads, an empire that preserves, a city that thinks. But even that library, with all its splendor, could not stop the collapse that was coming. In the end, it was flames that consumed Nineveh, and dust that covered everything. And in those ashes remained the question, what weighs more, knowledge or force? And in that question, the path toward the next chapter begins to divide. The fall of Assyria and the destruction of Nineveh. It was the end of an era saturated with unbearable power, of victorious marches across rivers and mountains, of marshes of ash raised by the Assyrian advance. But as happens with empires forged by fear, no matter how colossal they may appear, their strength can also become the seed of their downfall. By the end of the 7th century before our era, that same terror that had kept the masses in check nearly turned against its very creators. Internal rebellions, coalitions among longtime enemies, social clashes within Assyria itself, and the most unexpected contender, Babylon reborn, created a storm that could no longer be contained. In the shadow of those tensions, the once mighty Assyrian lion, which had roared with relentless fury for centuries, found itself cornered, precise, and doomed. It began with rebellions in the provinces, both inside and outside the empire's borders. The Medes, that mountainous people long regarded as savages by the Assyrians, began to organize. Rarely has an underestimated enemy become such a sudden and existential threat. They marched from the north in waves, again and again, and they did so with a clear purpose. There, on the plains of the Tigris, thirsty for accumulated vengeance, they found support in the reborn Babylonians, who, under the leadership of Nabopolassar, had been consolidating their own power and seeking the moment to exact revenge on their Assyrian oppressors. Nineveh, the emblematic capital of an empire that had mastered brutal civility and pharaonic military organization, began to tremble under the footsteps of allied forces. The city was already hostile territory for many. Its prestige was in decline. It still fed off the wealth extracted from recent invasions, but its resources were beginning to run dry. Bankrupt regions could no longer sustain administration, nor pay the tributes that Ashurbanipal had imposed, and those fissures opened the door to a different logic: economic boycotts, ambushes, constant harassment. It was in that context that, in the year 612 before the beginning of our era, the Medes and Babylonians laid siege to Nineveh. History, written in bricks and tablets, tells of a siege that lasted intense weeks. The walls resisted the assaults, the gates were barricaded, and even the gods trembled in their sanctuaries. But Babylonian logistics, more conscious, more pragmatic, more strategic than expected, managed to cut off water supplies, divert canals, and provoke scarcity. When the siege was finally broken and the city succumbed, everything that had symbolized the most violent expression of empire collapsed in a matter of days. Rivers of looters flooded the palaces. The tablets, until then carefully guarded in clay and wooden cases, were shattered or scattered by the crowds. The reliefs that had glorified executions and deportations were partially chiseled out, desecrated, or thrown into the fire. And the very citizens of Nineveh, both merchants and priests, began to plead that never again should the sword define the order. The fall was neither instant nor absolute. Remnants of the Assyrian apparatus resisted in small cities or rebel strongholds. But Nineveh, whose splendor had once broadcast Assyrian might to the world, ceased to exist as a command center. The palaces, reduced to mounds slowly buried by the wind, became objects of looting for jewels, metals, and wandering believers. Even the ruins were repurposed as quarries by neighbors from nearby regions. What was most remarkable, though less evident in the moment, was the political reading of that defeat. The Medes and Babylonians did not burn Nineveh out of mere caprice, but as a symbol, a reset of the regional order. From the ashes of the imperial lion, a different beast emerged: the Babylonian dragon, the renewed heart of Mesopotamia. The temples were left empty, and the structures of religious and civil power had to be renegotiated on a different foundation, one more attentive to the pact between law, shared memory, and social order. The terror that Assyria had once sown returned amplified. No kingdom wished to repeat such extreme strategies. For decades in temples and palaces, the Assyrian lesson was debated. War as a method may be effective, but it is also self-punishing. The cities that endured found in that experience a new framework for discussion. Between the evil that once maintained imperial cohesion and the fear that ultimately guaranteed future defeat. But the fall of Nineveh was also a warning to those who had suffered under the Assyrian campaigns. If they united, they could reverse their fate. That nearby example gained strength, and Babylon knew how to absorb that narrative. It would no longer speak only of architectural glory, nor merely of law carved in stone, but of a rebirth born from collective will. Its walls would rise higher, its temples more radiant, not to intimidate with the sword, but to demonstrate that there was another way to restore an empire, through its own glory. And thus, while Nineveh dissolved under the dust and sediment of defeat, another story began, one different in its foundations. Because when you look further, the fall was not merely destruction, it was opportunity. The opportunity to reinvent an order that would no longer rely solely on war. The opportunity to see, in the ashes, a new beginning, more cautious, more reflective, perhaps with less fear and more art. And that opportunity became the flame that ignited Babylon once more. Babylon, in the shadow of Assyria, was ready to be renewed. Its resurgence would not be a confrontation, but a monumental reconstruction, an architectural, religious, and spiritual rebirth that would evoke greatness without repeating destructive arrogance. The reconstruction of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar II. After centuries of looting and humiliation, when the rubble of Nineveh still smoldered under the relentless sun, Babylon began a transformation that was not only political, but also emotional and visual. It rose with the determination to erase the memory of Assyria through material means, through the magnificence of architecture and the splendor of ritual. At that moment, the king who would embody this rebirth emerged. Nebuchadnezzar II, a monarch whose figure combined the image of an obsessive builder with that of a demanding religious strategist. A sovereign who redefined the concept of power through colossal monuments, astonishing gardens, and a renewed religion deeply rooted in political reasoning. Heir to the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, Nebuchadnezzar came to the throne in the 6th century BCE, with the mindset of someone who understood that rebuilding an empire meant recalibrating its narrative. Babylon was no longer to be a city that merely defended itself, but one that presented itself as a symbol capable of enchanting and subduing without the sword. The wall of Babylon was rebuilt, as though it were an iron belt around the heart of the world. The Ishtar Gate, where zodiacal lions gleamed in vivid blue thanks to glazed bricks, became the emblem of a post-war power reconstructing itself through art. The Itamenanki Ziggurat, later revered as the Tower of Babel, was resurrected under his orders on a gigantic scale. Its base resembled a raised plain, with stacked terraces elevating the temple toward the heavens, as if attempting once more to paint a bridge between men and gods after the Assyrian interruption. Each step was a declaration of restored dignity, a vindication of a Sumerian past that suddenly returned to nourish the Babylonian identity. But if stone and brick expressed magnitude, it was the hanging gardens that embodied the most astonishing visual fantasy of his reign. Suspended over terraces and nourished by advanced hydraulic systems, these gardens were a display of desire. To retain plant life in the midst of an arid plain, to showcase technological mastery, and to express an intimate relationship between man and environment, as if Babylon could halt the death of the land within its own womb. These gardens became a testament to a politics that sought to impress through unexpected beauty, through awe that becomes memory. Yet Nebuchadnezzar did not limit himself to embellishment. He was a ruler fully aware that a solid kingdom required social cohesion and religious unity. For that reason, he built temples for Marduk that resembled terrestrial cathedrals. The Esagila was restored with marble and bronze, its entrance flanked by colossal statues. Ceremonies once again became charged with divine pomp. The walls were lined with inscriptions recalling the miracle of Babylon's resurrection after Assyrian terror. On the altars, daily offerings, chants, ritual games. The message was clear. The covenant with Marduk had to be reaffirmed daily, and Nebuchadnezzar presented himself as the vigilant intermediary. This religious centralization was accompanied by intense political activity. Strategic deportations brought populations from the Levant, Phoenicia, Judah, and other conquered territories, with the aim of reactivating agriculture, revitalizing trades, and diversifying taxation. The king did not seek to destroy the human element foreign to his kingdom. He incorporated it. He relocated populations according to economic and religious interests, promoted cults without erasing languages, and bet on an architecture of encounter rather than of submission. In doing so, he risked cultural tensions but cultivated wealth and labor capacity. The captivity of Judah is the most famous example. Nebuchadnezzar devastated Jerusalem in a harsh and symbolic military act. He destroyed Solomon's temple, but then imported artisans, scribes, and musicians, and established entire communities in a Babylonian district. The Babylonian chronicles speak of them in detail. Natives of Teman, skilled men for construction, accounting, and healing. This action continues to be interpreted as brutal, but it also reveals Nebuchadnezzar's imperial logic. The defeated remained useful if they could help revive a devastated city or restore a disrupted ritual. The economy grew. Canals were dredged with royal vigor, ceremonial navigation was promoted, and exotic products appeared in the markets. Semi-precious stones, cedar wood from Lebanon, spices from Arabia. Silver and gold circulated, but regulated loan systems were also introduced under priestly oversight. This new wealth derived from construction, trade, and worship. Nothing was left to chance. There was a deliberate distance between the precious and the sacred, the utilitarian and the ceremonial. Everything formed part of a whole, in which urban life became a demonstration of the contract between the human and the divine. Nebuchadnezzar's own figure was sculpted as a character who re-embodied the sacred king, the legitimate builder, the diplomatic victor, and the visionary governor. His inscriptions read like epic paragraphs. He cleansed the land of monsters, restored abandoned sanctuaries, brought life where there had been decay. He did not merely present himself as a successful conqueror. He claimed the role of protector, of pillar, of restorer. To his image, he added the idea of permanent renewal, of a gaze toward the future, even when each brick recalled a violent past. By the end of his reign, Babylon was a city that no longer recognized its recent destruction, that once again spoke with the breath of greatness through its walls, its gardens, its crystalline waters. But that splendor also generated anxiety. Who could endure such magnificence without anticipating the next fall? In Mesopotamia, excessive monumentality always cast a shadow. Upon completing his work, Nebuchadnezzar left behind a kingdom that rode between architectural pride and a subtle theocracy. He had rebuilt, but he had also prepared the ground for future challenges. His empire was exuberant but complex. Relations with Persia were already beginning to take shape. Internal migrations had changed the face of what Babylon was, and the next chapter will not speak of the sword, nor of military machinery, nor of majestic symbols. It will speak of diplomacy, of tolerance, of cultural and political openness, where the word began to grow stronger than stone. The arrival of the Persians and the end of an era. When the walls and gardens of Babylon still echoed with the splendor of the Neo-Babylonian period, an unexpected ending began to take shape. A conclusion without explosions, without fires or visible devastation. It was Cyrus II, known as the Great, King of Persia, who turned the fall of an empire into an open door to a new conception of power. His conquest of Babylon became the culmination of Mesopotamian history, not with the solemnity of destruction, but with the subtlety of a quiet and definitive shift, based on political cunning and religiously calculated tolerance. Cyrus arrived at the gates of Babylon during the night. In the year 533 before our era, his army opened the city gates without a fight, according to Persian chronicles and local inscriptions. The streets cleared the path for his soldiers, and the gates opened as if the city itself surrendered to an unavoidable fate. He met no resistance because he did not seek to crush it, but to absorb it. And so, the Babylonians received the conqueror with disbelief, confused by his benevolence. What followed was a masterclass in imperial diplomacy. Cyrus ordered the restoration of the cult of Marduk, the supreme god of Babylon, and issued public decrees to rebuild the temples and return exiled priests. His message was clear: I am not the enemy of your gods, nor of you. With this, he won the favor of a deeply rooted clergy and of a population humbled by Assyria and rebuilt by Nebuchadnezzar, yet still profoundly religious and bound to its rituals. By preserving their religion, Cyrus became a protector, not a conqueror. He also issued what we now call the Edict of Cyrus, a decree that allowed subject peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. That proclamation erased the memory of exiles and fleeting authoritarian impulses and established a new pact. Under Persia, each people could preserve its identity, its traditions, and its language. It was a cultural revolution wrapped in an act of strategic tolerance. The Persian administration integrated Babylon into its vast empire as a satrapy, a territory with partial autonomy. Local officials were retained. Scribes continued working as if the power structure remained the same, but now with a new sovereign who delegated authority. Akkadian remained the administrative language. The temple continued operating. The markets filled once again without fear of official plunder. The change was visible. A new king sat on the throne, but the continuity was so strong that many barely recognized the transition. With this act, a chapter came to a close. It marked the end of Mesopotamia as an autonomous world. Millennia of empires, wars, laws, ziggurats, codes, and city-states were now refracted through the vast reality of Persia, a multinational empire that embraced the Mesopotamian legacy in order to reinterpret it. An empire founded on respect for diversity, at least in theory, and on relative strength supported by effective administration. The end of Mesopotamia was not a lament, but a transformation. The temple ceased to function as a palace. The Mesopotamian king stopped being a local god. The ziggurats were left without new bricks. But memory endured. In chronicles, in tablets, in stories that crossed cultures. And above all, it remained in the Edict of Cyrus, a document that foreshadowed a key idea. An empire rules more effectively when it listens, preserves, and administers, rather than when it destroys. Babylon did not vanish. It transitioned into a new order. It became a province, a jewel within a broader crown. Its water kept flowing, its priests kept singing, its scribes kept carving signs. The hanging gardens and the gates remained standing, silent witnesses to a legacy that endured. But that endurance was no longer exclusive. It had become part of a global story, a crossroads of cultures and religions that shaped the world to come. And so, ancient Mesopotamia closed its era with a political gesture unheard of in the history of ancient empires: bloodless conquest. Cyrus the Great marked both an arrival point and a point of departure. From the Mesopotamian world to the Persian world, from endless war to administrative empire, from destruction to tactical respect. With that, the millennia-long saga of settlements, temples, codes, empires, and religions reached its final page, only to become a living legacy that would continue to inspire the empires and nations that followed. This was the physical end of ancient Mesopotamia, with the Persian kingdom claiming its inheritance and embracing its complexities without compromise. And although the future would erase many of its monuments, the ideas, the heavens constructed in clay, and the sculpted faces would continue telling the story of humanity that, in those valleys, had once invented civilization, before passing the torch to those who would rule the world with new forms and new languages, but with the same urgency to understand their place beneath the sky. And with that, we leave behind the lands of baked clay, cuneiform writing, and ancestral gods. The story of Mesopotamia fades into the distance, but if something from this journey resonated with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Subscribe if you wish to keep exploring other civilizations that also left behind deep and mysterious traces. Thank you for joining me tonight. Good night.